U.S. Navy history arriving. Welcome back to the U.S. History Navy Podcast. I am Dale, and Steven is still the XO and still very happy with the subject that we are covering.
Ironclad Part 2!
Yes. So you want to just jump right in? You want to get underway?
Let's cast off.
Alrighty. So we left off going around with the first battles of the Ironclads in the Civil War and the Lisa fleet battle. So now we're going to get into the armament and tactics that these things had.
I thought we agreed ramming, even though I think it's a terrible idea.
That's part of the tactics.
I'm scared to ask how long they were doing that when we get to that point.
We're going to be getting into it pretty quick. So, as you can imagine, the adaptation of iron armor meant that the traditional Navy armament of dozens and dozens of light cannons become useless because, all their shots would just bounce off the hull.
It's like 1812 all over again. Huzzah, her sides are really made of iron this time.
Exactly. So, of course, to penetrate said armor, they had to develop and mount heavier and heavier guns. But there was a different view, and that was the ramming effect. Because they thought this was going to be the only way to bring down ironclads. And of course, increasing the size and weight of the guns also meant moving away from mounting them all on the sides of the ship for broadsides and towards turrets.
Oh. So this is what introduced that, now fairly standard situation.
Yeah. So let's get into what you've been wanting to get into, and that's the ram craze. So from the 1860s to 1880s, again, many designers believed that the ram was a vital weapon in naval warfare because steam power freed the ships from the wind. And, the iron construction increased their structural integrity and the armor making them pretty much invulnerable to taking fire from cannons. So they were like, ramming, that's going to make a decisive blow. So let's do that. And of course, the very little damage inflicted by the guns of the Monitor and Virginia at the Battle of Hampton Roads, and the lucky success of the Austrian flagship, the SMS Erzherzog Ferdinand Max, sinking the Italian Re d'Italia.
Say that 10 times fast.
Re d'Italia. Re d'Italia. Re d'Italia. Re d'Italia. But just stopping at 3. This game... This is what led to the ramming craze. So from the 70s to 80s, most British naval officers thought that all of their guns were just going to be replaced by rams. They were going to just take out all the guns and install lots of rams. So you can ram them forward, backwards, and side to side.
So, bumper boats or water demolition derby for keepsies.
Yeah. Now, there was other voices of opinion that were completely ignored. And those were the guys that were trying to say, you do realize how many ships have been sunk by ramming, right? Not many.
It's fun, it's cool, we get it. But just because it worked a few times does not mean it should become a commonly adapted tactic.
Yeah. So, as you can imagine, with the ram revival, this had a significant change on naval tactics. Because, from the 17th century, the most used tactic of naval warfare had been the line of battle. This is, where fleets formed a long line and, just started shooting broadside at each other. This tactic, of course, is totally unsuitable for ramming. So the ram throwback threw fleet tactics into disarray.
Well, I imagine fleet tactics started looking more like a rugby match.
Yeah. So the question of how a ironclad fleet should deploy in battle to make the best use of the ram revolution, it really wasn't ever tested in battle. If it had been, the fights would have shown that the rams were only useful against ships that were already DIW, or dead in the water.
So they still needed to be shot at to damage or disable components.
Which is why the ram finally fell out of favor in the 1880s. It took them a decade to figure this crap out.
Guys, oh my goodness. Okay, I'm going to interject with something real fast, and perhaps we're about to hit this. What about instead of a round piece of cast iron, we made it relatively cone-shaped, so all that energy is directed into a very tiny point to penetrate the hull. And hell, we have exploding shells already. Why not have it set for a timer? You can do math relatively fast. And have it set to detonate. Oh heck, these things are heavy. Let's say 30 seconds after firing. I'm sure if you hit, it would have penetrated the hull by that point.
Yeah. That's when they figured out that the same effect of ramming could be achieved with a torpedo, which is less vulnerable to quick-firing guns.
Now,
so you are absolutely correct.
When you say torpedo, because the last time you said torpedo, you meant mine. Because apparently those two were interchangeable. This is an actual modern torpedo, right?
No, not yet. There's nothing here that's modern yet. Yeah, we're pretty much still talking about primitive naval mines.
Okay.
Now, naval guns. So the armament of the Ironclads, because of how heavy they were, they tended to have small concentration of powerful guns. They were trying to use these to penetrate the armor of enemy ships, at a good range. And of course, the caliber and weight of the guns started to increase more and more to achieve, better penetration of the enemy's hull. Throughout the entire Ironclad era, they were also grappling with the complexities of, rifled versus smoothbore and breech loading versus muzzle loading. They were trying to figure out what is working best. For example, the HMS Warrior, a British ship, they carried a mixture of 110-pound, 7-inch breech-loading rifles.
Holy crap.
And they also carried a more traditional 68-pound smoothbore gun. Or multiple guns. The Warrior actually showed the challenges of picking the right armament, because the breech loaders that she had were intended to be the next generation heavy armament of the Royal Navy. But they were like, this was poorly designed. We're going to not use them.
Well, weren't breech loaders kind of adopted as the standard after the kinks were worked out?
After the kinks were worked out. We're not there yet. The kinks
Okay.
are still there.
So pretty much their response was, yeah, we really appreciate the giant gun, but we don't appreciate being the testing department, so it looks nice, thanks.
But it's not working, so, push overboard.
Yes.
Yeah, because, breech loading guns, they do have advantages. They can be reloaded without moving the gun, which, is very, very convenient, because when you're moving the gun and doing, the rim loading or the muzzle loading, it takes time to do everything like that. With the breech, you just open the breech, shove everything in, and close the breech. And it also saved time if the gun needed to be re-aimed. They're also lighter than their equivalent smoothbore cousins, and these all had rifling, so they were more accurate as well.
I mean, I kind of want to ask what the Royal Navy got wrong with this initial, 116-pound breech loading monster, but if it was one of the first generations, I'm sure it's stuff that hindsight being 2020 we'd look at and be like, what the hell were you thinking?
Well, it's because of problems of sealing the breech.
Oh.
You know, yeah. I mean, all these guns are powered by explosives.
Yeah, and if that breech isn't sealed completely, I wouldn't want to be close to the gun if it isn't a complete seal.
Yeah. So, as the explosion propels the shot out of the front of the gun, it also puts a lot of stress on the gun barrel. So if this breech is not entirely secure, especially since the breech is what experiences the most forces and stress in the entire gun, well, the breech will break, which in turns, reduces the muzzle velocity, so it makes it not very accurate or powerful.
Instead of leaving the barrel, probably going something akin to 500 to 700 meters per second, it's probably leaving at maybe 200 or 300.
Yes. And what about that crew that's right by that
Ah, they're
breach?
expendable. We can replace them.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that's why the gunnery crew hates you.
No. I love our gunnery crew. I'm talking this is 19th century Royal Navy. We went over this, press ganging,
Yeah,
visit somebody on a pub crawl, and
that's
then they wake up, enlisted in the Royal Navy.
instead of, just taking care of your people. Anyway, so yeah, the first gun that on the Warrior suffered from all of these problems. And they're not able to penetrate the 4.5 inches of armor of a French ship. There was also times when the screw which closed the breech just, when the gun was fired, the screw backwards.
What?
And, yep, and now the gun's disabled. So this made the British pretty much just equip their ships with muzzle-loading guns of bigger and bigger breaches and pound shot velocities and stuff until the 80s. There was a brief time when there was a 100-pounder, which was a 9.5-inch smoothbore. The Somerset gun, I don't know if you've ever heard of that.
I feel like I've heard of it, but I just can't recall anything aside from I feel like I've heard of it.
It weighed 6.5 tons, and it was rifled. And this one had a very brief service life because they were like, we still need to get this bigger and bigger and bigger.
It was the naval equivalent of that World War II train-borne artillery piece that I cannot recall the name of right now.
We'll call it Big Bertha. So they increased the tonnage. They had 12-ton gun, then a 25-ton gun, and then a 38-ton gun. And then, they capped it out at 81 tons.
Okay, okay. What was the size of the shot being fired from an 81-ton gun?
It capped out to about a 16-incher.
What the heck?
That is the size of the modern battleship when they were still in service.
How much did that round weigh? This was a muzzleloader, right? You had to have guys team lifting these rounds and stuffing it like ye olden cannonball. Because it was ye olden cannonball, more or less.
Yeah, these were probably with a 16-inch shell. They were probably about a ton.
Okay, yeah. That thing over there, I don't want to see it anymore. Throw the tub at it.
But, I mean, the Brits, they still, even with these muzzleloaders, had superior performance in both range and rate of fire than the French and Prussian breech loaders,
Okay, well,
because they were still having the problems that the British found and said, you know what, we're done with that
we'll
for
we'll let
now.
someone else iron out the kinks. We'll stick to all reliable.
So from about 75 and then, onwards, the balance started to change between breech and muzzle loading. There was a Captain DeBange who invented a method of reliably sealing a breech, which was adopted by the French in 73. And, because of the growing size of the naval guns, which we just talked about, it made muzzle loading harder and more complicated. Because eventually they're going to get to a size where there's no way they're going to be able to reload the dang.
Yeah. I mean, at this point, with the size and, never mind the weight, you're probably talking a few minutes between salvos.
I mean, they had to invent a complicated hydraulic system to reload these bigger guns. Because they didn't want to expose their crew to enemy fire outside of the turret. So, you remember that 81-ton, 16-inch gun?
I do, Big Bertha.
Yeah. This was on the HMS Inflexible. And it could only fire once every 11 minutes.
Holy crap! Don't miss.
There was a 100-ton, 17.2-inch gun. This was on the Duvillo, and they only fired once every 15 minutes.
So instead of ringing the bell for the hour, gentlemen, fire a round.
At every time you fire a round, that 15 minutes have passed. So the switch in the Royal Navy between breech loaders and muzzle loaders was finally done in 1879. And of course, that's when they were like, we love this thing.
So much less complicated.
There was a accident that almost made them rethink their position again, because there was a huge explosion on board the HMS Thunderer because it was double loaded.
Oh!
Normally, this mistake can only happen on muzzle-loading guns, but apparently some idiot did it on the breech loader, double-loaded the thing, and blew it up.
So he gets half rations for a week for that.
More than likely, he died. So, of course, they're increasing the caliber and weight of these guns. So it, of course, becomes slower to load. There's another thing. The bigger the gun, the greater the stress on the hull, and the stability of the ship is whacked out. So the gun size peaked in the 80s, with some of the heaviest calibers ever used at sea. They didn't do this on the land. This was all on sea. The land guys were like, the Army was like, you know what, we're good with what we got. At least until, Big Bertha in World War II.
Wow.
The HMS Benbow carried two 16.25-inch breech-loading guns, each weighing in at 110 tons.
What the heck?
This double-turreted ship would have the largest guns mounted on a British ship until the 18-inch gun on the HMS Furious, which was in 1917.
I know here in the Navy, we like to think bigger is always better. At a certain point, bigger becomes impractical.
Now, the Italians would have the biggest that they fitted as a 17.72-inch gun until that 18-incher in 1917 came around. And then, of course, the Yamamoto in World War II comes in at 18.1 inches. They had to outdo the British by 0.1 inch.
Hey, that 0.1 inch is just because of principle.
So one of the things that became more realized was that the range and hitting power far exceeded just accuracy, especially, at sea where there's pitch and roll that affects it. So this, will negate the advantage of rifling. So Americans, they actually preferred smoothbore and, big smoothbores because the round shot could skip along the surface of the water.
Oh my, so we preferred the old way, not because we're traditionalist, but because we're such mad lads. We're like, hey, Captain, how much you want to bet I can get 3 skips before I hit the ship? No more than 2. 10 pounds? I mean, dollars, we're Americans, not British.
Yeah, so while everybody else is using rifling with the shell that goes with it, the pointy shell, and they're lobbing things not very accurately, the Americans are like, hold my beer.
Crew, we will settle this in the only way that gentlemen can in their time of war. Skipping cannonballs.
Yeah. So they learn that the range, they learned that the effective combat ranges were pretty much comparable to those when, everything was used with sailing ships. But a boat can now be smashed to pieces in just a couple shots instead of, 40, 50, 60 shots that a ship could take beforehand. Or even more.
And I'm sure it doesn't take, 11 to 15 minutes to reload.
Yeah. And of course, smoke and, just the normal chaos added to all these problems that they're having. Which means that most naval engagements were still fought at ranges that were, not where you could easily ram, but, also well below the maximum range of their guns. So there was another method of increasing the firepower of these guns, and that was to mess with the propellant.
Okay.
So most of these early ironclads used black powder, which, it's a rapidly expanding combustion that black powder puts out. So, shorter barrels, because they didn't want the barrels to slow down the projectile. But that also increased stress as well. Because of the rapidly expanding, you got all that stress on the back end of that gun. So they decided they were going to put the powder into pellets, which allows for a slower, more controlled explosion, which allowed them to increase the barrel length.
Isn't chemistry fun, kids?
Then they took another step, which was they went from black powder to brown powder. So it again slowed the combustion even more. This put less stress on the barrel, which actually increased the service life of a gun.
Can't say I've ever heard of brown powder. Like, is there, aside from a longer burn time, it sounds like, an ingredient difference, or?
This is prismatic powder. It's similar to black powder, but it is chemically formulated and hydraulically formed to a specific grain shape to provide a slower burn.
Oh, okay.
And because of this process, the powder didn't look black anymore. It looked more brown or cocoa powder.
So to call it quick and dirty, black powder is organic. It's all ingredients that can be found in nature combined in such a way to cause the desired effect. Brown powder is an artificially created black powder equivalent.
Yes, that's a good way to get in there without, bringing out char.
Yeah, the XO got a passing grade in chemistry. He finds the subject fascinating, but it is not his expertise. C's get degrees, folks.
So, then comes smokeless powder. This is based on nitroglycerin and nitrocellulose, and this was invented by the French.
Aren't those ingredients in dynamite?
Yes, nitroglycerin is definitely in dynamite. And it's actually explosive by itself. Very, very volatile and fragile explosive.
Hence why I'm wondering what inspired the French to think this was a good propellant for rounds?
Probably because when they put in the nitrocellulose, it stabilized the nitroglycerin.
Okay.
But I'm not a chemist, so tune in to the U.S. Chemistry History podcast to find out more.
At a certain point, we're going to have to make one of the spin-off shows. You realize that.
Maybe not. We'll find out. But this new smokeless powder, it allowed for even more smaller charges and longer barrels. So the battleships of the pre-dreadnought battleships of the 1890s, they pretty much had a smaller caliber weapon compared to most of the ships in the 1880s. Most often they had 12-inch guns. But, because of the powder changing, they made the gun happy by growing the barrels longer and longer.
So anybody who says size doesn't matter is lying to themselves, is what I'm hearing.
Yes. Of course, with all these other changes, the projectiles also had to be changed and invented. At first, they thought that the best projectile to go through that armor was just solid cast iron.
Ye old cannonball.
And then later they were like, no, we need chilled iron.
Chilled iron?
Yes.
Okay. Well, I'm not caught up on the U.S. Smithing History podcast. The heck is chilled iron?
It is a way to cast iron instead of doing it the way they normally did, which was the way they did it. They would use geometry of the molding cavity that they used to make the mold, which prevented directional solidification. This would be a harder, more solid cast than with the regular cast iron.
See, boys and girls, science and math is really cool.
And then, of course, eventually the armor-piercing shell was developed. And, of course, this is pretty much what you would come to expect in modern times. So, now we get to the positioning of all of the armament. So, the first British, French, and Russian ironclads. Because, they had a long history of designing warships. So, they put their weapons in a single line along the sides. And, logically, these were broadside ironclads.
Yeah, I mean, it's been working so far.
Now, because of their armor being so heavy, they could only carry a single row of guns along the main deck on each side, rather than, a row on each deck like the wooden variant. Now, the advantage of this design is that they were able to engage more than one enemy at a time, and that the rigging did not impede their fire. Because, turret, it transverses, the rigging can get in the way of the turret. Of course, there was also disadvantages, which, became more and more serious as technology developed. The heavier guns that they needed to penetrate the thicker and thicker armor that boats were being built with meant that they could only take fewer and fewer guns.
Right.
And of course, when they adopted ramming for a decade, this meant that they needed fire all around their boat.
Mm-hmm. You need a bow chaser, you need a stern just to help dissuade people from going up your rear.
So the ramming tactic made the broadside designs go away and brought the turret designs to the forefront. So there are two main designs that were all an alternative to the broadside. In one of them, the guns were placed in a armored casement amidships. This was called the box battery or center battery, And in the other, the guns would be placed on a rotating platform to, give them the broad field of fire. This was the turret.
So, quick question. Back in ye olden days of the 1860s, these turrets. Obviously, nowadays we have electronics and machinery to rotate turrets and get them where we want. This was all manual, right? Like, we're talking teams of
Yes.
guys, pushing and cranking to adjust elevation.
Yes. Yeah, everything's done by hand.
So, cannon gun crews before this, 2 to 3 guys. Do we know what the average size of a gun crew was before we got to comically large sizes of 11-ton gun, 16-ton gun?
I'm not sure how big the gun crew itself would be. The crew size of these boats ranges around 300 men. So, probably a third, if I have to estimate or guesstimate.
My goodness.
So, the center battery was, a simple design. And during the 60s and 70s was the most popular design. Concentrating the guns midships meant that the ship could be shorter, and it was also more handier than the broadside type. So the turret was first used in naval combat with the USS Monitor in 1862.
We do love to play with our toys here in the States.
Yes. And it was actually designed by the Swedes.
Yeah.
Guy named John Erickson. Thank you, Mr. Erickson, for allowing us to blow each other up better.
I am very happy to do so. You're welcome.
All right. Hey, I didn't know your Ouija board started speaking. That's very cool.
Oh, yeah, no, new feature. I upgraded after you locked mine in the closet.
Well, I mean, I had to. You were asking for it. Now, the Brits, they also had a designer who made a turret. And this was put on the HMS Trusty because they wanted to trust that it would work. So the Swedes version, this turret turned on a central spindle, and the British version on a ring of bearings. Turrets, of course, they offer the maximum arc of fire from their guns. But of course, there were significant problems. The arc of fire of a turret would be limited by the masts and rigging of the ships.
Okay, this is an ironclad. What do you need mast and rigging for?
Backup propulsion.
Yeah. Makes sense.
Yeah.
New tech, they're a little hesitant to fully embrace it.
The second problem was that, of course, these things were very, very heavy. So the Swedes were able to offer the heaviest possible gun turret by deliberately designing a ship with very low freeboard. So this saved the weight from having a high broadside above the waterline and diverted the actual guns and armor. Now, the lower freeboard also meant that the smaller hull, and that also meant smaller coal storage. So the range of the vessel wasn't very good. So they try to compromise the two extremes of the British and Swedish designs. And this was called squaring the circle. This was designed by Captain Cowper Phillips Coles. And it was made into the HMS Captain.
Named after the guy who invented this squaring circle turret?
I think Captain is his title, not his name. So this was a very dangerously low freeboard turret ship, which carried a full rig of sails. And it was launched in 1870 and pretty much almost immediately capsized. She had a half-sister, the HMS Monarch, and she was restricted from firing her turrets only to the port and starboard beams. They were afraid with stability issues with her as well. And then the third ship was the HMS Inflexible. They had 2 turrets on either side of the center line, which allowed them to fire both fore, aft, and broadside.
Oh, very nice.
Yes. Now, we can only hope that this was a better designed ship and didn't go down with, like the first one did immediately, or restricted her fire like the second one. Now, the French, they had a lighter alternative to the turret that they liked, which was the barbette. These were armored towers that were fixed to the deck and held a gun on a turntable. The crew was sheltered from direct fire, but of course they were vulnerable to plunging fire, like from, shore emplacements.
Right.
This was lighter than a turret, which means that they needed less machinery and no roof armor. But some ended up having all of their armor removed because they were still too heavy. So that brings us to torpedoes. This age saw the development of torpedoes as naval weapons, which of course helped complicate the design and tactics of the Ironclads. The first ones were static mines, which were used extensively in the Civil War, the American Civil War. But they also developed the spar torpedo in this day of age.
And what's the spar torpedo?
This is an explosive charge pushed against the hull of a warship by a small boat. Usually it's they put like a long, very long pole on the front of the boat, lash it down, and put the explosive charge on the end of that. And then ram right into a boat.
You could just say it's boat jousting.
It's boat jousting, but only one boat's participating in the joust. The other one's trying to dodge it. Or shoot the men inside the boat.
Red Rover, send over. Oh God, anybody but that boat, please.
So this was actually marked the first time that a large warship faced a serious threat from a rowboat. And, because of the inefficiency and inaccuracy of shell fire against small targets from these big ships, the threat of this spar torpedo was taken very seriously. So the U.S. decided, you know what? We're going to take 4 of our monitors. We're going to take the turrets off of them. We're going to take a big spar torpedo and put it on the front. They never saw action.
Oh.
There was a proposal towards a torpedo called the Harvey. This involved a explosive on a line or a outrigger, and this was to deter a ship from ramming into them, or to make a torpedo attack by a boat less suicidal.
Yeah.
And then in 1868, the self-propelled Whitehead torpedo was invented and deployed 2 years later. This torpedo formed part of the armament of the Ironclads, like the HMS Inflexible, in the 1880s. The Ironclad's vulnerability to the torpedo was a very huge critique to naval thought, because you put enough armor on the boat to protect it from gunfire, you make it slow to be caught by torpedoes.
So what was their proposed way to keep them from getting torpedoed?
Everything we've described. That's pretty much it. I mean, it's just an arms race now, buddy.
Oh yeah, because those always go well.
So we're actually going to leave it here. This is going to be a 3-parter because that took quite a lot longer than I thought it was going to. Maybe, I don't know, maybe even a 4-parter. We still got to go through the construction, the propulsion, and then get into the different fleets. And then, of course, the end of the Ironclad.
And then back to the Civil War.
Yeah, then we're going back to the Civil War. So, Steven, are you enjoying your Ironclad episodes?
We went in expecting one episode, and now I'm hearing it might be a 4-parter. So, I think the audience is going to need some subtitles. Like, it can't just be, Ironclad and then Ironclad 2. This is Ironclad 3, The Reckoning. Ironclad 4, Up Close and Personal. Ironclad 5, Ramming Speed. I don't know. We'll have the marketing team talk about it. We'll get some trailers going. I'm imagining a whole, cinematic universe. Marvel's got nothing on this.
You're also imagining that we have a production staff that rivals Marvel, but we don't.
Not with that mindset.
It's just me and you. All right, buddy. So, anything you would like to add before we pull back into port?
Well, the gun that I could not remember the name of was named Gustav.
Big Bertha. We like that one, though.
Both German. We have a Discord channel now, which you can find that in the show notes.
There you go. Left that one easy for you.
And in an effort to avoid embarrassing myself, I will simply say you can always reach out to us with email or via Twitter, and those links can also be found in the show notes.
But for our audience members who can't read, what would they be?
Well, my first question would be, how do you find us if you can't read?
Pretty picture. The podcast logo.
It is a wonderful podcast logo. All right, well, you can reach out to us using Twitter at USNHistoryPod.
Yep. You
can reach out to us with Gmail, I should say email, using USNavyHistoryPodcast@gmail.com.
Oh, what's so hard and embarrassing about that?
The last 3 episodes.
You can also visit the ship store.
Oh, we do have a ship store. I always forget about that. I forgot that we were worried about it sinking, but it wasn't actually sunk.
No, we just had to redact the podcast logo a little bit. All right, well, that's going to be it for us. Thank you for joining us. Oh, and if you could, leave a review for us. We don't pay to get, to advertise this show. So word of mouth and reviews help us immensely. So if you could do that, please do.
Yes, the YouTube algorithm may be unforgiving, but so is the podcast algorithm.
I think it's worse on the podcast side.
You're probably right. And with that,
all right,
we wish you fair winds and following seas, folks.
U.S. Naval History Podcast, departing.